Welcome to another Talking Point podcast. I'm your host Shugufta, and with me today I have Farhana and Zara. Assalamu alaikum to you both.
Walaikum salam, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam, Shugufta.
It's lovely to have you both. So today we are going to be talking about India. I have to say actually that this is a podcast we had planned for before the current escalation of events between India and Pakistan. I definitely had been seeing for a while now on my Instagram feed and over the news a continuous, regular series of attacks on Muslims in India, on Muslim women in India, students especially, female students. I'd also seen the elderly be attacked by mobs, and I could see that the authorities were not doing very much about it at all. And before this, I remember we had in lockdown and since then quite a serious escalation of oppressive measures on the Muslims in Indian occupied Kashmir. With, I know during COVID they had internet blackouts, there was a media blackout, there were harsh lockdowns, there were shootings. I saw specifically that there was shooting to cause blindness. So, there was a whole incident where the victims lost their eyesight due to direct sniper shots, you could say. And of course, now we've seen in recent weeks and days an escalation where the militaries of India and Pakistan exchanged fire. It resulted in bombings, killings, destruction. So let's get straight into it. Farhana, can you tell us some more about what life is like in India for Muslims today?
Jazakallah khair, Shugufta. The growing unrest that we've seen in India's Muslim community has been going on for a really long time, but particularly in the last decade, the new government, Modi's party, the BJP, since winning their elections in 2014, they've become emboldened in the attacks against specifically the Muslim community in India. There's been a lot of political turbulence, state propaganda, and what I have seen from social media and alternative media is communal violence that is very unpredictable, because a lot of these attacks can be random. So the whole environment has just become terrifying. Like, you don't know whether you're going to be attacked for something specific that you've done that has just happened to have upset somebody in the community. There could just be a mob that comes and gets you, or even your neighbor could turn on you. There is a specific site, people will know about this, DOME, the Documenting Oppression Against Muslims. They've done a really good job of documenting oppression all over the globe. The stuff that they've done on India has been very, very eye-opening. I'm going to focus on specifically about the Delhi riots that took place in 2020. And the significance of that is because it is the capital of India. There was violence that erupted after peaceful protests took place against the Citizenship Amendment Act at that time. The Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA in short, was the first time that the government was able to use religion as a way to deny or give citizenship. So there was a lot of video evidence that emerged from that, where police were beating up young Muslim men. They were forced to sing the national anthem while bleeding on the ground. We saw mosques set on fire. We saw Muslim homes and shops being looted and destroyed. And the day after these attacks, Muslim activists and students, even though they were peacefully protesting, were picked up under terror laws. And the mobs that were present at that time walked completely free. They saw that there was complete silence from the judicial courts. There was a complete silence from the media. And I think the worrying thing was just the lack of condemnation from the community in general. So you've got millions of Indian Muslims now waking up to the fact that there is a real concern for their safety, and that safety is conditional. And for Muslims of India who are indigenous to that land, they have been there for centuries. Suddenly now their identity, their belonging has been put into question simply because they are the wrong religion. And the irony is the fact that India has never been known to be one homogeneous society. This is a country where you have 1,600 languages alone. This is what I found out.
1,600 languages.
1,600.
Like, you mean dialects of dialects of?
These are completely separate languages, and there 122 are considered to be major. I mean, if you ask me to name languages, I don't know how many, maybe just 10 off the top of my head I could probably come up with, but this is what I mean. India has never been known to be this, this one society, one language, one culture, one type of food. It's really difficult to describe what is an Indian, what is an Indian Hindu, what is an Indian Muslim, what is an Indian Christian, right? So that's a real challenge, you could say. How do you overcome something like this? And that's where you have this Nazi-style ethno-nationalist revivalist movement. It's the same ideology that is carried by the Zionists. It's a very typical right-wing style, similar to what we've seen in Western countries in the past, Germany, Scandinavia, and the UK even. And specifically in India, this type of nationalism has been created to exclude Muslims and other non-Hindu religious denominations. So when you're looking at the core idea of Hindutva ideology, it's basically linking Hindu identity with nationhood, sort of like combining the two things together. So they're saying that to be truly Indian, you have to be tied to being truly Hindu. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is about making India great again. It's referring to a time previous to Islam and the British invasion. So they've started to change historical narrations and realities to one that fits with the Hindutva model. And they've done this by selectively picking out certain symbols like, scriptures or figures within Hindu history to unify this version of Hindutva identity. They've done this by branding. So festivals, temples, rituals, even food, they've become certain markers of your loyalty to the motherland. And this obviously creates this us and them. Also erasing the diversity in India by streamlining all the different types of Hindu denominations into one that fits a certain narrative and a common enemy, the Muslim community in India. And Muslims have been targeted. The fact that they say, well, the British were our enemies, but they've left now. But the Muslims, who are also, in inverted commas, invaders, they're still here. And, we need to deal with them somehow. And so, look, the bottom line is Hindutva ideology is racist. And we know that racism is not some kind of discourse that's intellectual. It's very emotional. When you see the kind of rhetoric that's coming out from these politicians, from these influencers, from even Bollywood actors, it's very emotional, provocative language, very primitive even. But you can see how easy it is to get people behind something like this. And so the lynchings, the torture in prison, what happened at Aligarh University, where the students were attacked, the number of hijab attacks that we've seen, Muskan Khan in Karnataka, it's not surprising at all that these things have come about.
And this is not just in mainland India, but what about Indian-occupied Kashmir? What's life been like there for the Muslims?
Yeah, Kashmir really deserves its own discussion. Kashmir has been occupied since 1947. So it is the Palestine of India. It has been occupied for the same number of years by a equally brutal occupation. And really, it's just a reminder that there's so much division within the Ummah. And, you can draw parallels. There's been a negligence on Pakistan's side when it comes to how they've dealt with the Kashmir issue, the same as how the Arab regimes have dealt with the Palestine issue. And so what has happened is a festering of not disappointment, but hatred, really, of like, why have you left us in this situation when we're supposed to be one? We're one people. It's like an analogy of, siblings, essentially. You've left one brother on one side, another brother on the other side, and they've forgotten the fact that they are siblings, that they've come from one family. The other issue with Kashmir, which was quite shocking, it is the most militarized place in the world. So in 2020, from the Armed Conflict Survey, it was recorded that it was one soldier for every 30 civilians. In 2025, it is now one soldier for every 20 civilians. So they've economically crushed Kashmir. They have subjugated the civilian population there. They have crushed real development, real infrastructure. And they have adopted the same settler colonial ideas where they're moving parts of the Hindu population into Kashmir, using Bollywood, using media to recapture this fake narrative, which is that Kashmir belongs to India, very, very similar to what the Zionists have done to Palestine. It's beyond sad. It's so dangerous what we're seeing over there.
Okay. You did talk about the Citizenship Act and the Delhi riots that occurred after that, and there were arrests of Muslims, like you said. But some would say and argue that this is not India as a whole, but that this Hindutva movement and ideology, this is actually held by just some extremist right-wing nationalists who are not representative of Indian society, that they are not representative of the Indian government even. After all, India has the third largest population of Muslims at 200 million. India also has other religious groups apart from the Hindus, like there are Christians there are Sikhs there are Buddhists, there are Jains. In the past, some people have described India as a melting pot or a salad bowl of different cultures, different religions, languages, like you said. To take a term from one of those languages, people have recently said that it's more like a thali, which is like a meal made up of separate dishes served on the same platter, that this is an analogy for India. And they claim that all of these different groups of people are able to maintain their own way of life. So, Zara, what would you say to this as a criticism that this is not reflective? Everything that Farhana has spoken about is not reflective of India as a whole.
Well, if anybody is pushing a line of narrative that this is just being carried out by fringe elements against the Muslim community, then we just have to look at the number of demolitions that have taken place within the period of 2019 and 2024. I pulled out the figure, and these are just registered numbers of demolitions. 33,477 have taken place in that period. That has affected 20,643 people, meaning that they have lost their homes, their property, their mosques, and largely this is from the Muslim community. And the government agencies had to dole out $12,051,000 in order to carry out these projects in the northern Uttarakhand state, which is run by BJP. In 2023, there were mega clear-up projects which saw 3,000 mausoleums just razed to the ground. And the chief minister of that state openly called this as a crusade against land jihad. Now, land jihad is a term that was coined by the Hindutva nationalists, saying that there is this conspiracy that the Muslims are in on where they buy land within the locality in order to squeeze the Hindus out from the community. And this land jihad term is being flagrantly used as a fact by the media outlet, and it's going completely unchallenged. In 2024 alone, 7,400 Muslim homes were demolished, and this was done by state-sanctioned bulldozers that came in and razed their homes to the ground. And if anybody was to protest or was to, voice their grievances, they would have to face a violent mob with police forces just standing back and doing nothing. Or in many cases, as Farhana said, they would join in with the beatings of the Muslims. Plus, they would be then arrested under different terror laws and under different disruption charges. Amnesty International recently did 2 reports where it said that the Muslims in India are facing something called bulldozer justice. Now, bulldozer justice is a term being used to show what the Muslims are facing. This is a quiet type of justice that happens against any of the activists within the Muslim community who would have the courage enough to come out and protest against the barrage of laws and policies which are coming out from the BJP government against the Muslim community. So Farhana mentioned the Citizen Amendment Act, which was rolled out in 2019, which meant that the Muslim community alone would have to present their deeds and documents to show Indian origin, even though they've been living in India for decades. Just this month, they blindfolded and removed Rohingya refugees who were holding UN permits, allowing them to seek asylum within India. They were taken across the border by the Indian police force and just dumped in Bangladesh. So this is happening on a daily basis. And when I mentioned the bulldozer justice, a very famous example of Afreen Fatima, who's a CAA activist, but her dad was charged with trying to orchestrate tensions by coming out in protest against the mocking of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by Nupur Sharma, who's a BJP spokesperson who went live on air and openly insulted the Prophet, evidently trying to stoke these communal tensions. But who bears the brunt of these type of tensions is the Muslim community. The recent bill, the Waqf Act of 2025, has been passed this year. Properties and money which is donated by the Muslims in the way of a charity in order to benefit the community. I myself have studied in a Waqf property donated university. So these properties are used for the benefit of the community largely. So not only would they be invested for building mosques and shelters and orphanages, but also schools and hospitals, which are open for Muslims as well as non-Muslims. This is a well-known fact. However, with the new amendments in the Waqf Act 2025, two major ones which are quite is that one, the Waqf board, which previously would be run by Muslims in order to regulate these properties and invest them into community beneficial projects, would now be overrun by non-Muslims. And in the current Hindutva climate, everybody knows that it would have many Hindutva nationalist officials placed within these Waqf boards to then regard one property or another as either Waqf or state-owned. So in the background of the Babri Masjid that had occurred, there was a lot of rhetoric and narrative around this masjid that this Waqf property actually has been taken by the Muslims and had a temple demolished and then a mosque erected. And so what we saw was the series of litigation processes through the judiciary and through the media campaign to build and solidify the false narratives and present them as fact. And therefore today we see that this Babri Masjid was demolished and then a huge Ram temple was erected in its place. So in the background of all of these demolitions and Muslim properties and sites being reclaimed by the state in the name of them being built illegally or being encroached on railway land or forest land, we can understand what the fear must be of the Muslims when these type of acts are passed and the government takes complete control of not only the properties of the Muslims, but also their private residential properties. If I was to just highlight another example of how this has been completely politicized and completely changed into official laws, I would give you the National Register of Citizenship, the NRC, which has been rolled out just to see how it might work in Assam. And this led into total disaster, seeing thousands of them just picked up and put into detention camps. One of the biggest detention camps in India is in Assam. It's called the Mathia Transit Camp is what they have renamed it. We had at that point when CAA got rolled out, we had really distressful stories of the likes of Rashminara Begum, who was 3 months pregnant, and she was taken into one of these detention camps. She was denied proper food. She was beaten. She could not even ask for any home food to come from her household. Her husband had to sell all of his property, his business, just to cover the legal fees. And she was released on bail once she gave birth. So evidently, it is quite, known in India. It's very palpable that the Indian Muslim community is facing not just threats from these random mob lynches that everyone knows are orchestrated by state agencies, but also it is being enshrined within the law of the government through the various amendments of the very constitution that they claim is democratic, is there to protect all citizens and give them equality and good treatment.
It definitely, it sounds a bit like this gradual erasure of Muslim existence taking place in India, as though they were never there in the first place. Let's just erase any proof of that. I mean, what you're telling us about is in India itself. What about in Kashmir? Has the government, I mean, is there any evidence of government-led, state-sanctioned policy in India-administered Kashmir, which is affecting the Muslims there?
Of course, our brothers and sisters in the Valley of Kashmir have faced immense horrors as outlined by Farhana, and these horrors have been never ending. And they have been done under the veil of providing security and protection to the state of India from extremist and militant elements that emanate from Kashmir, and that they make use of Pakistani militancy in order to create instability within the state. But we know that could be not farther from the truth. I would really urge the audiences to watch a documentary which details personal stories of civilian population within Kashmir. The documentary is called The Trail of Torture on Kashmir, and it's been put together by one human rights lawyer named Parvez Imroz. He's done such an excellent job, but the poor man, you can see the distress and, the resignation in his face, but he just keeps on hoping that due process is going to help in one way or another. And the kind of testimonies highlighted in that documentary are truly shocking. The boys and the men would just be taken by the Indian security forces over there. By the way, it's very similar to the IDF. They call themselves the Indian security forces who've been stationed in Kashmir. They would be picked up for random reasons, for pelting stones, for creating disorder. And that comes under the PSA Act, which is called the Public Safety Act, 1978 Jammu Kashmir Public Safety Act. This is an act which gives the carte blanche powers to the Indian security forces to pick up these boys or the elements who might be creating any sort of disturbance. And you don't need an excuse in Kashmir. From what you hear from the people, they get picked up, they get locked up. And the torture truly is horrific. I mean, you would remember the torture tactics that were being justified by the American administration, the waterboarding and the secret prisons. It's nothing different in Kashmir. One is the roller treatment. Now, the heavy rollers would be rolled over the body of the detainees to the point that their insides would be crushed. And many of these detainees do not survive from kidney failures. Their trousers would be lit on fire and their skin would burn with no medical attention, with the burn marks still to date, serving as a reminder to them as to what happens if you ever ask for freedom from such a horrific military occupation of India. And as Farhana highlighted, Pakistan has done an abysmal job of looking after its brethren just across the artificial border. The Indian security forces and the Indian government roll out one policy and law after another. The recent amendment of the Indian Constitution gives powers to the Indian government now to take Kashmir and Jammu and Ladakh as union territories and integrated into mainland India, therefore opening up these lands to the population of India to go and buy a property, open up businesses, and literally changing the demographics of that area. Azad Isa, he's done a brilliant job. I would definitely recommend the audiences to read his book, Hostile Homelands, The New Alliance Between India and Israel. And he has shown such stark parallels to how the Kashmiris and the Kashmiri population and that area is treated compared to the Palestinians by the Zionist entity. And with this new narrative that this is a settler colonialism, it's been militarily occupied. It's just that the doors have now been opened to the civilian society of India as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to say about this, but this is just a few highlights of what our Muslim brothers and sisters are having to face all by themselves against this state-sanctioned endeavors against them.
Yeah, we can link below for the audience both the documentary and the book that you have recommended for people to watch and to read. I mean, I did hear actually in the recent weeks that 1,000 young boys and men were, I don't know, rounded up, taken from their homes.
Yes, they do. They get rounded up, and thousands have
Yeah,
just disappeared
1,000
over
I
the
heard.
decade.
Yeah.
1,000 is probably just a
It's
recent
just, yeah,
number.
just the recent number from like the past
Yeah,
couple of weeks
yeah,
since
like
these
12
new
years ago, the
escalations.
number was at 70,000, and these disappear and nobody knows where they go. But actually, there's been mass graves, unmarked mass graves that have been discovered, and there are hundreds and thousands of sites which are still undiscovered. The human rights lawyers are constantly pleading the UN to come and do an investigation. Let's do a due process and uncover the terrorizing by the Indian forces, but nothing comes through. In fact, it's been recorded that the Indian soldiers do this on a massive scale, and they get kickbacks from the Indian government. So this is an open secret for anyone who is willing to do
Okay.
any sort of digging.
Right. Okay. I mean, you've both mentioned Hindutva. I think we need to go into this a little bit more. Farhana, can you give us a bit more of an understanding of what is Hindutva? I mean, what are the characteristics of it? What are its values? What does it represent? I mean, is it linked to Hinduism or is it something else?
Okay, so I mentioned before that Hindutva is the same as Zionism and Nazism. This is something that many commentators have stated. Recently, Dr. Muzammil, who's a Kashmir expert, has done a whole series of talks where he looks at the parallels between the Hindutva ideology and the Zionist ideology. This term Hindutva was coined in the 1920s by their founding father V.D. Savarkar, who basically believed that India belonged to the Hindus. And they've been influenced heavily by Italy's Mussolini, Germany's Hitler, and their fascist ideologies that existed at that time. And apparently they did have some relationships back then. And that's unsurprising because of the very, very close relationship that Hindutva has with the Zionist entity today. And we're going to go on to that, I think, inshallah, a little bit later. The way they see it is that if the Zionist entity can ethnically cleanse and otherize and dehumanize the Palestinian population, and they can see that no one has batted an eyelid, then that goes the same for the Hindutva movement as well, that they can do it too. And what's happened is that they both share this ethno-religious supremacist value. They both want to politically reshape the population and reshaping of the land as well. So you know how you heard about the Greater Israel Project? India also has the same, the Greater India Project. They also have nation building, which sounds very harmless, but these are, again, are very dangerous projects. The use of education to shape the way that national identity is looked at, reshaping a nationalistic history, and again, creating this common enemy that poses a threat to that national identity. And all of this is compounded around race and religion. And so there's a lot of emphasis in India's glorious past, the Vedic civilization, empires like the Maurya and the Gupta. They have these figures like Pratap and Shivaji. These are considered to be the new heroic nationalists who basically opposed the Muslim rulers at that time. And, you know, that the fact that the Hindu civilization was very pure and it became corrupted later on, and that we need to go back to this, you know, back to this time again. And any Islamic contribution, whether it's architecture, whether it's art, whether it's science, any type of culture, even like the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal periods, these are well known within Indian history, well established within Indian history. They are just either ignored or they're minimized. And it's a historical farce because when the Muslims came to India, in terms of literature, culture, architecture, it was unrivaled.
Yeah, there's wide recognition of this.
Wide recognition, not just on that side of the globe, but even from the Western perspective as well. And you can see that the Zionists, they do the same. So they talk about Israel's glorious past, biblical kingdoms of David and Solomon that have been glorified. And they talk about their exile, and which some of it is true, but it's all framed as trauma and victimhood. And the Palestinians are to blame for it. So the Zionists will say that the Palestinians and the Arabs are recent arrivals. They're the aggressors. The Palestinians don't even exist as a people. And they are marginalizing them, denying that they have any historical ties to that land whatsoever. When it comes to Palestine, this region belonged under the protection of the Ottoman Islamic State. They've tried to sever that there's any Islamic history, i.e. that the Ottomans themselves, they were the invaders and they were the colonizers. They've created this black hole through the education system, distorted historical context. They have severed that Islamic link. And so Zara mentioned previously about the issues that surrounded the Babri Masjid. This masjid was destroyed, and then they built this huge temple on top of the remains. We're regaining our glorious past. And this is exactly the same as what the Zionists want to do in Al-Aqsa, where they are looking to take over the Al-Aqsa compound, where they claim that their temple Solomon has been built. So without going into it too much, I would encourage that the audience can find more information about this. Dr. Khalid Al-Owaisi does an excellent job with his Jerusalem study, so I do recommend people to go away and have a look at that. I just want to end with one more point. We are seeing that this situation that's unfolding in India with the Hindutva ideology, it's completely ignored by mainstream Western media, by the West in general. Some of that can be attributed to racism, but I think it's quite clear from the 19 months of genocide that's been taking place in Gaza, and from some of the language that has been used by Hindutva politicians, especially since the recent attack in Kashmir, is that the West actually have no problem with barbarity of these kind of ideologies, because they themselves will say that, India is a democratic and economic powerhouse in that region. They will say that the Zionist entity is the only democracy in the Middle East. They will say that the IDF are the most moral army. And they will say the same for the Indian forces within Kashmir as well. They will justify to continue with whatever project is within self-interest. So both of these nations are considered to be allies in the Western Empire. And so the atrocities that are taking place within these lands are going to be ignored, regardless of how much attention is brought to them.
We can definitely link to the Jerusalem Studies series of lectures that you spoke about. We'll link them down below as well for our audience. But I just want to pick up on what you said about India as a democracy. For sure, India is the largest democracy in the world. So I'd like to ask you, Zara, how is it possible that the international rules-based order is allowing the largest democracy in the world to continue like this? And actually not just allow, but I've seen Narendra Modi be entertained and hosted all over the world, yet he faces, doesn't he, serious allegations of war crimes. The Gujarat massacre of 2002, I remember that. He had definitely a hand to play in that. And you both have spoken about what continues to this day, not just in India, but India-controlled Kashmir, in terms of the abductions, the torture, the rape, the extrajudicial killings, the arson, the unlawful arrests. Is this not too much for democracy, for international law?
It's quite interesting you asked that question about Hindutva gaining this huge prominence and global acceptance by the world powers, and especially the Western powers, because, Modi, as you said, has been connected to the Gujarat riots, being the chief in command there in Gujarat, giving explicit instructions for the police to stand by and watch the mobs attack the Muslims and pillage their properties. But having said that, now we see Modi is the prime minister of the largest democratic country in the world. I would pin it down to three main aspects as to how Hindutva has found a very comfortable spot in this world order, which, frankly speaking, has been developing a certain narrative against the Muslim population globally. Our audiences might know, I certainly do remember, is the war on terror that was unleashed and rolled out by the Bush administration in 2001 after the September 11 attacks, where George W. Bush had said that you are either with us or against us. This war on terror meant that now America would be policing the entire world, trying to put out global threats from the Muslim community. So this Muslim population has become a problem population that is barbaric, that has got terroristic tendencies, that is a jihadist, machete-wielding psychopath that the entire world needs to be very wary of. And so you saw large-scale campaigns of fighting war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, which led to millions losing their lives, losing their properties. Till today, we can see the effects of this horrific war on terror climate that was created. Now, in this global climate, many of the far-right nationalist movements have taken advantage, because now it would give them the excuse to say that all we're doing is fighting terrorists. All we're doing is protecting our national interests and national security. So in the same vein, the Hindutva movement gained the prominence, and not only did it gain prominence, it was celebrated and it was decorated, and it managed to open up its lobby groups internationally. You've got the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh. It is well known to be a global mouthpiece for the RSS's genocidal agenda. RSS is a paramilitary wing of the Hindutva ideology, which was created under the mentorship of the founder of Hindutva, V.J. Savarkar. And this group trains and indoctrinates youth in India for the past 100 years already, in inculcating the ethos of the Hindu nation state, and with rhetoric such as Khand Bharat, meaning Greater India, the great civilization that Farhana was talking about. This is the civilization that they seek to reestablish, which is purified of all the non-Hindu elements and return to its previous glory. So Modi, in this newfound valor and glamour, who would be fighting in his robes against the global terror threat, has made use of several tools. So not just the lobbying in America, but also the Bollywood industry that has frankly become quite epic in its own right. You've got movies like Mission Kashmir and Kashmir Files and Hotel Mumbai, Commando 3, and the rest of it has always been, even pre-Modi, has always been feeding the populations of India and globally a subconscious caricatures of the Muslim terrorist individual and the Muslim terrorist groups who are out to get people or just enjoying themselves and gathering. And you would have random suicide bombings, which would completely destabilize the Indian nation. The second part to this is, I would say, identity politics. Now, with identity politics, we've seen that play out even with the British politics. Remember, if you may, the British values debate where the Muslims were meant to show whether they're British first or Muslim first. And there was a barrage of discrimination and Islamic phobic attacks against the Muslims across Europe, but also in the media, where the hijab would be vilified as backward and oppressive. And the Muslim populations in Muslim countries need to be democratized and need to be taught how to live freely, how to not oppress their women, and how to not give away their children into child marriages. This is the same tactic which is being used within the Hindu nationalist propaganda, that you, as a Muslim living in India, has to prove your loyalty to the Indian state. Be a Desh Bhakt. Otherwise, you will be seen as an anti-patriot, anti-national, a threat that needs to be dealt with, a threat that has to be de-radicalized, that has to be re-educated, that has to be punished and reformed, and then re-assimilated and rehabilitated into the wider Indian community. And unfortunately, we have seen that this kind of propaganda and fear-mongering has created such a repressive climate that the Muslims in India are very fearful to come out and protest or voice their grievances, lest they'll be seen as a threat to the society. And that's the very reason why we have the Shah Rukh Khans and the Amir Khans that I grew up really, enjoying watching their movies, to find out that actually they themselves have been subjected to these kind of propaganda tactics. And not once have they uttered any words of solidarity or brotherhood to what's going on to our Muslim brothers and sisters in Palestine. So there's been a complete clampdown and silencing of the Muslim community under this identity politics and war on terror narrative. But thirdly, I would say that Modi truly, he has been embraced with such a warm welcome across the globe. And who else better to welcome him into the global stage than Barack Obama himself. 2014, when Modi won the general elections, Obama called him up saying, "We invite you to Washington and we are very pleased and we congratulate you for winning these epic elections." And so we saw the red carpet rolled out. He landed in Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, meeting with the NGOs there. He met with the Clintons in New York. He dined at a private state dinner with Obama. He met with John Kerry. He even spoke with the Hindutva lobby groups over there. And I would definitely recommend a book written by Peter Friedrich. It's called Saffron America, in India's Hindu nationalist project at work in the United States, and how entrenched it's become to allow Hindutva politics and Hindutva lobbying with the American establishment, dealing with them on a regular basis and convincing America that what India is doing is for the interest and the greater good of America and global peace and security. Other than America is our own Muslim countries in the Arab land. The Abraham Accords were signed by the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia is still willing to come to the table and normalize relations with Israel, all in the name of economic prosperity, forging trade relations. In fact, Saudi Arabia was the one who was hosting Modi in Riyadh when the Pahalgam attacks happened, and Modi's jet was escorted by the Saudi fighter jets which have not been seen by the people to protect their skies from the constant bombardment of the Israeli drones. Saudi Arabia also does not shy away from holding naval drills with the Indian forces in the shared maritime waters. So the joint naval exercises and embracing has clearly given messaging to the Hindutva nationalists that the Muslim rulers are here to embrace them and will not lift a finger against the massive oppression that is being rolled out at every level against the Muslims in India and Kashmir.
Okay, so it does look like the world climate was ripe to welcome Narendra Modi onto the world stage, and that's why we've seen, I guess, him welcomed in this way. But I'm just thinking, before it was India as we know it today, which is an India sitting next to Pakistan, Bangladesh, Kashmir in two parts. We have the Pakistan administered Kashmir and we have the Indian administered Kashmir. So really we have 5 areas of land today. Before this, it was occupied by the British for almost 200 years. And before the British, we had a very different story where we had we had a culturally diverse part of the world, like it is today, but instead of all the turmoil that you're both describing, there was enough cohesion in society for there to be a rich history, there to be flourishing arts scene, there was a flourishing literature scene, there was a flourishing architecture. I mean, the region was economically prosperous with fertile agriculture, thriving trade in textiles and spices. This is why the British went. The British went because there was so much success and there was so much prosperity. So what happened? I mean, I don't want you to go into British rule. This is not an episode about British rule, and we can't really go into that. But the British left, and now we have Hindutva. So what's the story? What happened in between?
Everything kind of joins in together, and it brings us to this point of a proud Hindutva Indian nation state. You're right, Shagufta. I mean, the Indian subcontinent was thriving prior to the British coming in, and it was under Islamic rule. There is recorded figures of 24 to 27% of the GDP being contributed by India alone into the global GDP. And this is one of the things majorly that attracted the British colonizers to come and siphon away the resources of this land. And you would see that the colonizers have a very succinct and straightforward tool called the divide and conquer. It would profile the populations according to their ethnicities and the language and the religion. So with India, Britain would take a census of the population and group them together according to age and caste and religion and occupation, where the populations would now see divisions previously quite invisible under the Islamic rule. After having the census in the 1800s, the Muslim populations started to become quite wary of these newfound identities, being the Hindu versus the Muslim. And it was within this change in the climate, where divisions were being sowed in by the British Raj, that we had the likes of Vijay Savarkar, the founder of the Hindutva ideology, just like Theodor Herzl was the founder of the Zionist ideology. Now, Vijay Savarkar was serving time in British jails. But what he did was that he sought clemency from the British Raj by promising to serve the British crown in any capacity whatsoever, as he has now started to view not the British, but the Muslim population as a problem population, as an enemy, a threat that needs to be dealt with in an ideological way. So he wrote the book, which was published in 1923, called The Essentials of Hindutva. And this outlined the ideological movement's articles of faith, if you may, just like the Der Judenstat, written by Theodor Herzl, who claimed that the Jews will only be safe if they have their own Jewish state, a homeland that they can call theirs. Now, B.T. Savarkar wasn't very far off from the claims that he was making as to what would protect the Indian nation from the Muslim threat, purging this Indian subcontinent from populations which have, according to his ideology, muddied and disempowered the Indian civilization. And, we really have to highlight how European thinkers and philosophers and the British colonizers have contributed to the development of this narrative. Because remember, the far-right Hindu nationalists were not being educated within India. They were flying into the British capitals and the European capitals, where there was already thinking going on, talking about the Indian subcontinent being an ancient Hindu civilization cradle, where all humanity emerged from, and humanism was lifted from Hindu values. And this would come as a shock to many, but Jawaharlal Nehru and Gandhi too were educated in these capitals. We would be naive to believe that these type of narrative did not have any impact on the Hindutva ideology. And when the British had to withdraw, because evidently Britain was spread out too thin, it could not just pack up and leave, because it would mean that the Indian subcontinent would return to bringing the community together cohesively and building its GDP. So what Britain did was that it put a line in the sand. It partitioned India and Pakistan. This subcontinent, which was thriving, now becomes a place of mass displacement, where nearly 18 million people are having to leave their homes, their properties, and move from one side to another along religious lines, of Pakistan being a Muslim majority and India being a Hindu majority. And this saw about 2 million people being killed. And the worst part is, actually, it would have been a joke if it wasn't so dreadful and sorrowful, is that this is being accepted by everyone, especially by the Western nation states and the Western media, as being just another day in the making of history. The partition of India was used as the great example by the Wall Street Journal, that got quite a lot of backlash, and rightly so, which said that this is something which happens, which has always happened, where nations get divided into separate nations and mass displacements occur. So Trump's plan of ethnically cleansing Gaza is not a new plan. So these have been undertaken by the colonizers in order to create these lines in the sand, which then get reinforced through barbed wires and walls and armed troopers who will make sure nobody moves from one land to another, but dividing the resources and dividing families and properties. Because till today, we have seen Kashmir being labeled as a disputed territory, where we see Pakistan having its water resources of the Indus Valley in the hands of the Hindutva Indian nation, an infrastructure which was left behind by the British Raj, which then continued to be nurtured under the label of national interest and national identity and preserving the national borders. And this is how the British managed to leave, not quietly, but leaving a legacy of colonial rule through pseudo-colonialism, where Britain still has a say and still manages to exploit the resources, the labor, and the GDP of India till date. Because remember, this was the crown jewel of the British Raj, and no way were they going to lose their control over this territory.
Wow, subhanallah, you've certainly shown how the British did have a hand in not just what we have seen for 77 years now in Palestine, but also, almost a similar time period in India. I think a lot of people do know now, especially after 18, 19 months of genocide, they do know where Zionism came from and where the idea of Zionism came from. I think you've given us, some information now about where Hindutva came from and how it had similar beginnings. I think there's a lot there for people to go away and do their own research on and learn more about this. But yeah, the similarities are definitely there. Farhana, you showed earlier and you spoke earlier about these similarities also. And a lot of people have called Kashmir the Palestine of Asia, and India being called the Israel of the region, especially with its recent emboldened attacks on both Kashmir and Pakistan. We have discussed the similarities between Zionism and Hindutva. Can you tell us some more about the relationship that Israel and India enjoy now today?
Yeah. The relationship between India and the Zionist entity have always been there. It's not something that's new. Under the previous Congress party, before the BJP, their approach was, a little bit different. It was very similar to how the Arab nations in the Middle East have taken, which is, to put it bluntly, a two-faced one. They wanted to build trade, they wanted to build diplomatic links within that region. And so it helps if you appear to be pro-Palestine. So this is the face that they showed. What happened when the BJP came into power is that they declared that relationship openly. So it basically broke that myth that the BJP is some problematic party for the West. Zara did a full breakdown of how Modi was welcomed back into the fold, right? He gave a speech, I think it was in 2016 at Madison Gardens, like he was some kind of, superstar, off the back of the fact that in 2005 he was denied visa into the US because apparently he was inciting religious hatred during the Gujarat massacres. So, for them, anything can change, with the flick of a button, to be fair. Since the start of these diplomatic relations with the Congress Party, that was back in 1992, till 2022, bilateral trade between the Zionist entity and India peaked at around $10.77 billion. And this is excluding defense. Currently, India is considered to be the Zionist entity's second largest trading partner in Asia and the 9th largest globally. In regards to now defense, within the last decade, India has imported 2.9 billion in military equipment and tech from the Zionist entity, which makes it one of the largest. In 2022, they had this agreement called the Defense Cooperation, and it's a 10-year roadmap that was signed between them. And this includes joint manufacturing, bilateral trade agreements in terms of, swapping surveillance tech and military warfare. So there was a joint manufacturing between Adani and Elbit Systems. They produced 20 Hermes 900 combat drones that were then delivered to use in Gaza in February 2024. In just this month, in May, Pakistan shot down 25 Zionist-made Parab Mk2 drones. Zionist forces, they have used AI weapon systems that were co-produced by Indian Arbel systems that basically enhances machine guns and assault rifles into computerized killing machines in Gaza. So I think everyone knows this term, the Palestinian laboratory, and how the Zionist entity uses Gaza as a testing ground for its weapons.
To sell these battle-tested weapons.
Yeah, and they're very blatant about it. They will say these have been tested. It's so disgusting. These have then been given the go-ahead for India now to be used on the people of Kashmir. And why not? Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza with absolutely no international accountability. You can't blame Modi for having reason to believe that he too can then escalate his nationalist project.
Yeah, it's a green light, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's a green light to Narendra Modi or any other
Up and coming, ethno-nationalist party. Absolutely. There's also the issue of workers. So since the genocide started, there's been around 80,000 Palestinians that are not allowed to gain permit anymore within the occupied territories. That's between West Bank and Gaza. So they're now importing workers from India. The last number was around 16,000, which is obviously nowhere near enough, that have joined Israel's construction sector. However, this number is, increasing every month. So this is a new plan they've got where they're going to be replacing the previous workforces. And then just briefly, cozy normalization between India and Saudi and the Zionist entity. India has always maintained a very strong tie with Saudi Arabia economically, culturally, and strategically. And they've done this through the energy imports, the expatriate workforce, while Saudi Arabia is well aware of the occupation of Muslims in Kashmir. So it's not like India needs normalization between Saudi and the Zionist entity. However, further normalization is obviously going to contribute even more positively, economically, to be specific, to a more stable Middle East. So there is this new project that has been in the pipelines, which is called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. In short, the IMEC. It's a bit of a mouthful. And this includes Saudi Arabia and the Zionist entity. Okay, so what is the IMEC? You want to consider it as a major infrastructure project. It essentially wants to level up whatever trade they've got going on. It wants to create more efficient connectivity between India, the Middle East, and Europe. And they want to do that through railways, roads, ports, pipelines, data cables. And they're looking at two main corridors. One is to link India to the Gulf, and the other one is to link the Gulf to Europe. And this project is strategically in opposition to China's Belt and Road Initiative.
I was just going to say, it sounds a lot like China's Belt and Road Initiative that it has with Pakistan.
That's right. So it's an opposition to both. It's basically just sidelining Pakistan. It's competing with China. And this is really the prize. And where these elites and the rulers and where the politics is, this is the level at which they are functioning on.
Cooperating on, really.
Cooperating on, yeah.
Definitely.
This cooperation we've already seen unfolding. We had a taste of it when the Houthis had attacked the cargo ships in the Red Sea, and we saw all of a sudden, the ports in India started to send their ships over to Saudi through the land corridor that goes via UAE up to Jordan, and then delivering the fresh fruits and veg and everything else that Israel needs for its daily sustenance. So that's one thing that we saw emerge. But the other part about the close military ties between Israel and India, it's become so close. Azad Isa actually very frequently talks about this. He does his podcast as well, the one who's written Hostile Homelands, that Indian officials practically go into Israel and learn and train the tactics which are deployed against the Palestinian people, and then they bring this back into mainland India. So one example is the farmers' protests, how they were dispersed by using drones to gas the protesters from marching onto Delhi. And the other is the AI smart borders that have been used in Kashmir, where Indian security forces don't have to worry too much about having boots on the ground, but they can artificially create walls using artificial intelligence that has been tried and tested on the Palestinian people in order to keep track of every household and every individual.
They were Sikh farmers, weren't they, that protested, and then the Indian government responded?
It was predominantly the Sikh. The farmers community does have others as well, but it was the Sikh farmers from Punjab and from Haryana who were being affected by another amendment to the farming law, which meant that their farms would be opened up to the private companies. But those farming laws have been repealed now, which would mean that the private corporations would not be able to take advantage of the harvest of India.
Okay, definitely lots of close connection and a very close relationship between Israel and India. Let's turn our attention now to the Muslims. What has been the response from Muslims in India? And with respect to Kashmir, I mean, we can see that the leadership of Pakistan, you've both touched on this, has, to all intents and purposes, abandoned Kashmir more and more over the years. The occupation and the oppression in India administered Kashmir is left completely unchallenged. And, it has just emboldened India in not just its persecution of the Muslims in Kashmir, but in taking more and more land from the Muslims. And I think it was you, Farhan, who said that in this, the Pakistani leadership can be likened to the Arab rulers who have abandoned Palestine. The people of Pakistan, though, we see, much like the Arabs and the Muslims themselves in the lands around Palestine, they've not forgotten their brothers and sisters. The Pakistani people, I would say, know and remember only too well what their brothers and sisters are going through across the border in Kashmir. What do you think of this, Zara?
Definitely, Shigusta. Everyone would agree that the Muslims, no matter how many nation states that they have been divided into, allowed the easy subjugation of our brothers and sisters at the hands of such nationalist-leaning governments and also at the hands of the Western hegemonic empire. It just leaves the Muslim community a bit strapped in the sense that they do not know where to go from here. They are literally torn between trying to do something, anything, to come to the aid of their suffering Muslims in Kashmir, suffering Muslims in Palestine, but they keep on coming across roadblocks. And a barrage of anti-terror laws that would clamp down and label them as an extremist or a terrorist, where young students are losing their degrees when they voice their opinion and stand in solidarity for their Muslim brothers and sisters in Kashmir. Unfortunately, the recent attacks that took place, the Pahalgam attacks, was a bit of a litmus test as to how the Muslim community in India would respond. Obviously, the Muslims in India were showing their support for the Muslims in Kashmir and Pakistan and were fearful that their Muslim brothers and sisters across the border would be facing Indian fighter jets and Indian bombing. But at the same time, they were the likes of some of the ulama Hind who had put out statements saying that the Muslims in India would have to, in this time of need, show their patriotic leanings and show their solidarity with the Indian nation and the Indian armed forces and side with the secular Indian national identity. And unfortunately, the Muslims have got really nowhere to go. They have no due process. We are constantly told that India is a democracy. And the due process that is undertaken, everybody knows, goes on for years and years, whether it's property cases, whether it's our youth being locked up under anti-terror laws. Nobody is listening to them. They are completely leaderless. They are completely without a guide. They have no help coming from any of the rich Muslim nations that we saw lavish trillions of dollars to the Trump administration to cover all the costs that they have made to unleash mass slaughter of the Muslims in Gaza. I mean, this money, this wealth has never once been directed to rescue the Muslims of India or Kashmir or even Afghanistan. In fact, Pakistan has not only abandoned Kashmir, it's also abandoned Afghanistan and is starting to alienate many of the Muslims within the Pakistani community itself under nationalistic callings of them being Balochi or them being Pashto or them being of the terrorists of the tribal belt, which has unfortunately caused the Muslims to turn anywhere where they could find a bit of help. So Afghanistan, unfortunately, had sought the help of the likes of the Modi government, and the Chabahar port was then developed with the cooperation between Yeah, Afghanistan and Iran to the exclusion of Pakistan. And you would see that these nationalistic, anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim forces are starting to gather up and gain ground and entrenching itself in the infrastructure of the Indian subcontinent. The Muslims in India, unfortunately, are truly torn between their Islamic identity and their Indian national identity. And they know help is not going to come from anywhere, but they are forced to keep calling for the United Nations, keep calling to the secular constitution of the Indian government, which bears zero fruit, unfortunately. So I would say that the Muslims need a leadership, a safe governing apparatus, which saw the cohesion of the populations in the Indian subcontinent, in the Arabian Peninsula, and across the globe.
Yeah, and I mean, earlier I mentioned how before the British, we did have a very different story in this part of the world. India was both culturally diverse and yet enjoyed enough cohesion in society for there to be the rich history, flourishing arts, literature, architecture, economic prosperity, enough, for the British to want to come and colonize for the 200 years that they were there. So we really, I mean, we do need to look at, how was this possible? How was this achieved?
I would really add to that, Shagufta. This cohesion that we saw under the Islamic rule in the Indian subcontinent also saw the likes of the Mongols defeated due to the kind of unity and the kind of cohesiveness where there was no us and them. It was one unified bloc where the Hindus and the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Jains and the Christians did live peacefully and coexisted.
How did we have cultural cohesion and cultural diversity?
I think you have to go back to what is ethno-supremacist ideologies rooted in? Nationalism. It's the breeding ground for racism. It's all good when you can keep it confined within a flag, food, language, but actually you are encouraging people to think of themselves different to another group of people that have been separated by this arbitrary border. And within Islam is completely rejected from the Quran and from the Seerah and through any systemic application throughout Islamic history. So when Allah says in the Quran, "O mankind, we created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you." This verse directly refutes, racial, ethnic superiority, and it centers the value on piety and good character. And in the Prophet ﷺ's farewell sermon, when he says that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have any superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a black, nor does a black have any superiority over a white except by piety and good action. So this idea is reiterated again and again. And even throughout the Seerah, there were incidences where there were like potential fights about to break out between the Ansar and the Muhajirin. So there was one example of a Muhajir who kicked an Ansari man. And so what happened was like they started sort of getting into a bit of a brawl, and then the Muhajir started calling his people, the Ansar, started calling his people. And then the Prophet ﷺ heard about this. And then when he came and said, what are you guys doing? Like, you're returning to the old ways of tribalism. Muslims were not this one homogenous society. Muslims from one end of the Islamic authority would enjoy different cultures and different languages and food from Muslims who lived on the other side of that state. And the thing that bonded them together was the shared belief system that basically directed them in life. And the same goes for the non-Muslim communities that lived under the Islamic authority as well. So it's also within Islam to impose your belief onto another community that doesn't share that same belief with you. It's considered to be oppressive. Umar bin al-Khattab was so careful that he did not fall into any kind of coercion or to take away any rights of any non-Muslims. We talked about this in a previous episode. It was the last in the Palestine series where we talk about community cohesion, how societies functioned under the Islamic political authority. But just briefly, justice is sanctified in Islam and it's for all. It's not something that's exclusive just for Muslims, because establishing dignity, security, safety, these are basic rights that the Creator has given to the human being. it rejects racial and ethnic superiority, both socially and politically as well. And this is what paved the way for a society that was relatively harmonious. In the Quran, the verse is 105 to 113 in Surah An-Nisa. There was a man from Banu Ubaydik who stole a bag of flour and weapons from a companion. He went on to try to frame a Jewish man by planting some evidence. The case was then brought to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who initially leaned towards the Jewish man because of the fabricated evidence that was against him. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervened in this case with these verses of the Quran and acquitted this Jewish man and then exposed who the real criminal was. So this is how Islam sanctified justice, that even the Creator used an example of a Jewish man that got falsely accused of theft to then be exonerated by the Creator himself.
Allah being a witness to every small thing that we do and every big thing that we do. And this basically did lay down the foundations for the Islamic ideology and the Islamic system, where the ruling establishment and the people within the society were always nurtured to remember and recall that Allah is the Most High. Having this kind of mentality is so different to the capitalistic, where money talks, where power talks, where might is right, regardless of what kind of oppression and divisions that you are unleashing within a community. But from Islam, when you have the might, you also know that Allah is the Almighty and all-powerful, who will set you right in this world and the akhirah.
Yeah, Allah set the limits for us. So the limits don't shift. And this liberates the mind from its desires. It liberates it from having these prejudices. So there's another ayah of the Quran where Allah says, "O you who have believed, persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves." This is talking about, creating this independent mindset where Allah has told you that racism, for example, is evil. So you accept it. And therefore you go on to then develop a society that's based on rejecting racism. You're not left to your own devices trying to figure out whether people of a different color or a religion is human or not. Whether you should be thinking about, does this human life deserve protecting in comparison to that human life? Whether it's okay to be killing people en masse, civilians en masse. You're not a follower of what the masses think. You're not a follower of what the status quo is. You're not confined within that box, or you're not confined within what your desires are. So this is in complete contradiction to what we are faced with now, which is there is no fixed outlook on life. If you're talking about just international law, for example, this is their, ahkam. It's very fluid. On the one hand, they want to talk about protecting minorities and how they want to save women from oppression from, far corners of the globe, yet they're able to accept the carpet bombing or Iraq or Afghanistan. They're able to destroy churches within Palestine, yet they want to talk about how the Christian community is being treated in other parts of the Muslim world, where we know in history, the leaders that we had under Islam, they protected the churches. Umar bin al-Khattab didn't even pray in the church in Jerusalem because he was so worried that later on down the line that people would then end up trying to take over this church. So from the Western perspective, when it comes to their freedom, this is a freedom that is only embedded within self-interest. So international law is whatever is within the political interest, whatever is within the imperial interests. It has no limits. It has no red lines. It doesn't sanctify human life. When I was growing up, there was this notion of, you only live once, so make the most of it. And now we see the likes of Jeff Bezos searching for immortality and crazy things like that. Yet, for people who believe that you only live once, you would think that the value in human life should be the most important. Yet we can see that you can kill hundreds daily with absolutely no concern and not even a bat of an eyelid. So there is a sad irony in all of this.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, both of you. Before we end, I'd like to ask you both for your final message, please. Zara, if you could go first.
Jazakallah khair, Shagufta. I think Farhana highlighted very clearly the difference between a man-made system and a system that has been mandated by the creator himself. The man-made system would be riddled with contradictions and ironies, and it would be riddled with oppression at the hands of the ones who hold power, who hold influence, who hold the biggest mic, who hold capital and money. Capitalism itself worships and idolizes money. It idolizes the privatization of resources which are meant to be for the usage of populations that belong to that land. As mandated in Islam, you can never ever privatize any of the resources, whether it be fuel or whether it be water resources or whether it be large pastures of land.
I want to end with Surah Ibrahim. Allah says, this book, the Quran, revealed to you, O Muhammad, in order that you can take mankind out of darkness and into light by the permission of their Lord. When I think of this ayah, I think about the West, what's happening in the Middle East, and obviously the focus today on India, the way that they have come together to accept and necessitate, whether it be a genocide, whether it be the IMEC project and other geopolitical interests at the expense of human life, requires Muslims who are the thinkers, the strategists, the ones that carry Islamic political thought with clarity, the scientists, the journalists, I mean, I can go on, to really think about how Islam has given us these tools to revive the justice, to take mankind out of the darkness that we are in right now and into this light, to remove the tyranny and to remove the oppression that we are faced with. How does it go about doing that in this current political reality? How do you challenge that between India and Pakistan? They are not even able to call out to their brothers because they're going to be called traitors. And they're already being accused of being traitors without even doing that. For the Kashmiris, where Pakistan has not come to their aid, yet when there has been an attack on the border of Pakistan and India, immediately Pakistan went ahead and had no problem in shooting down these Zionist-made drones and jets that flew in. When it comes down to it, your arbitrary borders have allowed this situation to perpetuate itself. And the same can be said for Palestine. As they keep saying, you can't even move a bottle of water into Gaza. So I think what we need to be thinking about is, how do you stop oppression? How do you stop the genocide? How do you stop any of these atrocities that are taking place and the situation that we find ourselves under when the capitalist system believes that these things are in its interests?
And on that note, I would like to thank Farhana and Zara, both of you. Jazakallah khair. I think you've given our audience a lot to think about, a lot to go away and do their own research on. We will be sharing some links in the caption below, so please check those out. If I could also ask our audience to like, share and subscribe, please. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.